Okay.
Publish.
Okay. Do I have to do anything else?
Maybe drag the slides over and share screen, or share screen and drag the slides over. The screen too, share screen too.
Okay.
And share,
Okay.
and then drag the slides over, and then drag those people back over to your side.
Okay.
We're almost there.
Okay.
And then just drag that other thing over to your screen.
Yep.
To the left.
Okay, let me do that. This thing, right? Drag this over. Okay. Okay.
Okay, welcome.
All right.
We're here to talk about, we've heard a lot of talk already today about people concerned that AI might interfere with learning. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how AI might complement student learning.
Hi, everybody. I think everybody knows who we both are, but in case you don't, I'm Stephanie Pritchard. I'm in the Office of Learning Services. I think everybody knows John.
Probably.
Probably.
Everyone there.
Yeah, everybody knows John. So what we're gonna say to kind of get started is if you would like to download these slides, then you may take a moment to do so.
And click slideshow.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. It's
Yeah, if you download them, there's
Yeah.
going to be some links in there that will ask you to look at it and use, so it'll be convenient if you do, and it'll put them right into your Google Drive. You can delete them later if you don't want them.
So we'll give everybody a second to do that. I see if there are phones on this end. Thanks, Mamta.
Yeah, if you're using a phone, just aim your camera at it and it should give you the link to download it to Google Drive. If you're on the computer, you could type it in. Or, well, yeah, let's try.
Yeah, I see people are still doing it.
What I normally do, I didn't get to, is grab a file with all the URLs to drop into chat, but I didn't. Been busy day.
Yeah. All right, I think everybody is okay, but if not, then we can always go back. Oh boy.
Okay, so I've got some things. Oh,
wanna go back?
you know, that there's always been resistance to anything new when something comes new into education. You know, this goes back at least to Plato, because we do have written words from Plato, and we know what he said, because before that we didn't have that many written records. But Plato was really concerned that the existence of writing and keeping records of things in writing would make it harder for people to learn how to remember things. And there's a quote from Phaedrus. I lived through the whole debate over whether electronic calculators should be used in schools. And I remember teachers in my high school back then who were arguing that, you know, without electronic calculators, people might never learn how to take the square root by hand or how to find cube roots and so forth. And, you know, I've never had to take a square root by hand ever since I got an electronic calculator, and I'm awfully glad I never had to. We certainly saw some arguments about computers and so forth, but even more so with the introduction of things like spell check. I remember on campus there was a huge debate in the English department about whether spell check should be allowed because students won't learn how to spell. And you know, many of us have spent a lot of our careers far too much time correcting spelling and grammatical errors on student papers. And it would be really nice if we never had to do that again, because that was not the most productive use of our time. And it really didn't help students to become much better writers when there's free tools that they could easily install. You know, and the internet, I remember also being a lot of concern because people could go out and find anything they needed there, and it was going to ruin education. And it's really hard for me to imagine teaching today without all these tools. So, you know, digital documents is another issue. We've had some of those discussions on campus recently, some previous workshops. You know, it's just so much more convenient to be able to search for things online. I remember card catalogs and going up in the moldy attics or the moldy 4th and 5th floors of libraries, digging through journals and then Xeroxing them, spending a tremendous number of nickels or dimes and then later, you know, cards on those things. And, you know, I think AI is another tool, and it's probably as dramatic as the printing press. in terms of the effect that it may have on the way we work, the way we interact with people, and the way we learn.
I am going to do this for 1 second because there was a request in the chat to post the presentation link
Okay.
in the chat, so I'm sorry, John. Oh, good Lord, come on, man.
Just hit the escape key.
Okay.
But one of the, well, just to say a little bit more about that, you know, most employers now are using AI in some of their processes. Many workers are using it. And, you know, just as we wouldn't expect someone to be hired to do writing, to do copywriting without having access to spelling and grammar checks, you know, we might very well get to a point where people may not be hired if they're not able to use AI, because people who use AI, it allows them to boost their productivity quite a bit. Okay, so I was going to do more of the first half, and then Stephanie will do more of the second half.
Yeah, we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit. So, and please bear with me, I'm doing this and monitoring the chat too, and John is helping me do it.
I'm taking the session off, so. You know, but one of the things is that, you know, a lot of the tools that people have access to, spell checkers, grammar checkers, thesauruses online and so forth, allow people to learn, and it's all based on work that other people have done, just as the content generated by GPT and other AI tools. So yeah. Okay. You know, one of the big issues is academic dishonesty in AI. Academic dishonesty is a big issue. Surveys of high school students in recent years have found that 60 to 70% of high school students in a lot of surveys report that they had at least one form of academic dishonesty, academic cheating behavior, and they specified the specific types in those surveys. We don't need to go into the details about it, but we certainly have many of those students coming to us in general. And an interesting thing is that if we go back to 2020 or so, the numbers have remained pretty much steady. So we haven't really seen, at least through fall of 2023, an increase in student-reported academic dishonesty. One of the things that has happened, though, is the nature of that dishonesty has shifted a little bit. We saw a huge boom in academic integrity violations during the pandemic with online testing, you know, and remote teaching. Then the next point. And what happens is that Chegg became immensely popular, and it became really commonly used in a lot of our classes. But what's been happening is that Chegg's share price has been plummeting. I didn't find a record on how much it fell last year, but it's fallen by 50% just through May of this year alone. And that's mostly because people have shifted from using Chegg to do work to using AI tools. But one of the main points there is we've always had academic integrity violations in various forms, and it did increase during the pandemic, but it hasn't really seemed to have increased much since then. So let's talk just a little bit about AI detection, because that's one of the things people are most interested in. The best reported statistic on this is Turnitin, who advertises that they have a 98% accuracy rate in detecting ChatGPT generated content. And for the most part, that has held up when students use very simple prompts and work is submitted, a simple one-line prompt. It will get close to 98% accuracy in detecting it, with very few false positives for US students. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But one of the things that happens is that if students just revise their prompts a little bit and ask it to change the voice or change the level of it and so forth, it breaks down a little bit more. And the other thing is, if they're using Claude instead of ChatGPT's, the free version has declined in quality fairly dramatically over the last year or so in terms of the quality of its responses. They've been optimizing it so that it doesn't take quite as many resources, so they can serve more users and so forth. But ChatGPT right now is much worse in terms of the quality of its responses than it was even 6 months ago. But if they use a free version of Claude or some of the other tools out there, it's much harder to detect. And one of the nice things about Claude, an interesting thing about Claude, maybe not such a nice thing, is that you can feed it a sample of your own writing, and then you can ask it to use your own voice in generating content. And that makes it a bit harder to detect this type of thing, because it's now using phrases that, or patterns of speech that you tend to use, or patterns of writing that you tend to use. And the other thing is that most of these databases, especially the free detection services, do far worse than Turnitin's advertised rate. Some of them have like an 80 or 90% error rate in testing by independent reviewers, but pretty much all of them were primarily trained on ChatGPT-3 or earlier iterations of that. And most people now are using 3.5, which is a current default free version, or 4.0, or perhaps even the 4.0 Omni release, which came out in the last week or so, which is much harder to detect. And it looks much more like writing from a human. And that was the point I got out of order.
Sorry.
Okay,
Yep.
that was my fault.
Yep. So I'm going to talk for just a moment a little bit about AI detection tools and their bias toward non-native English speakers specifically. I know that this is something that's been coming up kind of a lot, right? Like we talk generally about how detection tools are biased, but not, you know, like we haven't been giving lots of examples as to how they are biased, or the study specifically that talks about that. So I've linked this study here that I would encourage you to check out. It was published last year in 2023, and the, you know, kind of like the summary of the study overall did reveal that AI detection tools consistently misclassify non-native English writing samples as being AI generated, whereas writing samples from native English speakers were accurately identified as human written. So to kind of delve into that a little bit more, the study looked at a good handful, right? 7 popular detection tools. And the study evaluated 91 TOEFL, which, if you're unfamiliar with the acronym, is a test of the English as a foreign language essays from a Chinese forum. And it also looked at about the same number of essays written by 8th grade United States students. So the detection tools accurately identified the essays written by US students, but labeled more than half of the TOEFL essays as AI generated when they were not, which is pretty alarming if we think about, you know, like the number of students that we have, the number of students on our campus, right, who do not speak English as their first language, and then the number of people in general who are, you know, using these tools or not, right? And what it means to be accused of using an AI tool, right, to write your essay when really that's not the case. So this is problematic for a couple of reasons. One of the interesting things was thinking about how the essays that were that like had more of a robust vocabulary were tended to be identified as being written by humans. And that's one of the reasons why the TOEFL essays were labeled otherwise, because, you know, like if you are learning the English language or any language, your language proficiency is going to be a little bit more limited, right? You might not know all of the adverbs and the adjectives and all those sorts of words, right, to make your writing more robust. So that's one of the biggest reasons why those essays were labeled the way that they were.
Which means we should be especially careful when accusing students who are not native English speakers.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that I've done in my own classes in English 102 specifically, as I was thinking about like what generative AI tools would mean for me as a teacher and for my students as learners. Some of these things I had already been doing a little bit already. But I decided to see the different ways that I could, you know, choose to incorporate AI tools, or really just think about the assignments that I was giving my students to help them approach their writing in a more authentic or genuine way. So this is something that I've been talking about for a little bit. So I'm going to apologize if you've kind of already heard me talk about this, but I personally, right, I believe that if you teach a class that has a writing component, scaffolding your writing assignments is the way to go. This is how I personally feel about it. Anything that you can break up into smaller pieces, I believe is beneficial for our students. Not only, right, does it help students avoid the like, oh, I waited till the end of the semester to do this and now it's due in 12 hours and I'm freaking out because I have an 8-page paper to write. Like it helps with that. But like for me, as somebody who works with people who are, you know, like learning how to write in college, it can be a really helpful way to help them manage their workload and understand all of the different components that go into writing an essay. Because it is really different to write an essay in college than it is in high school, especially depending on how much experience you have with writing, you know, depending on what your high school did for you or, you know, what kind of experience you have coming in. So in addition to doing like a scaffolded writing process, I did start integrating generative AI tools in the fall and spring of last year. And I had students use the tools, mostly ChatGPT because, you know, it was free. Claude was free too, but I had experimented more with ChatGPT, and honestly, that was the tool that they were all talking about anyway, so it just made sense to me. So I did have them experiment with ChatGPT a little bit and reflect on their writing process either with or without it. Okay, so in my English 102 class, they have a scaffolded writing assignment that it's like a semester-long writing project, and I break it up into 4 different parts. And they're very cleverly labeled parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 to keep things simple.
A suggestion from AI.
Yeah, right, yeah. So basically what I have them do, and I've got the assignment later on, but I have them kind of start by choosing a community that they currently belong to. So this is either like something that they're really interested in, something that they're majoring or minoring in when they're in college, a way that they personally identify, right, or something else, right, like a hobby or whatever, a job they've done. So I have them choose a community that they belong to, and in that first part, they basically write me a really casual, I call it an essay, but it's not even really, right? They write me a really casual thing that just like describes what the community is, how they belong to it, and why they've chosen that to write about. In the second part, they have to create an annotated bibliography with a thesis statement and credible sources. The third part is a draft of the essay, and the fourth part is the final essay. So basically what we do, so what you see in parentheses are some of the ways that I was able to integrate AI tools into this assignment in various ways. I want to make a note and say that some of my students were super excited to learn about how they could use these tools, and others were super resistant. So it really was like a personal choice, right, from many of the students in my class. They were probably split about 50-50 in the fall. In the spring, it was more like 75-25. The 75 were the ones who were excited to use the tools. So basically for part 1, I had them use the AI tools to help them brainstorm, and I have an example of that assignment later on. Part 2, I had them use the AI tools to help them think about what kinds of sources they could look for. The free version of ChatGPT can offer examples of real sources, but it's limited.
And it's usually wrong.
It was able to offer things from like government sites, you know what I mean, and like other information that's freely published on the web. But if you are looking for, you know, like scholarly information, etc., like it's super limited. But that was still a really helpful exercise for them to realize how limited it was. We also looked at another kind of AI tool that's called Research Rabbit. That I introduced them to help them look for sources that they had fun kind of experimenting with. We also, in part 2, used generative AI to create like kind of samples of annotated bibliographies. And if you click on the link, it will bring you to a process paper assignment that I'll talk about in just a minute that I had the students complete. The third part, as they were kind of like making the draft of their essay, we used generative AI to make outlines for them to kind of like follow through, which they found to be usually helpful. And then the last part, We talked about revision, but we also talked about how AI tools could be helpful for citation and things like that. So how I integrated the AI tools in addition to like class exercises with each of the different parts is when like part 1 was done and submitted, they had a few days afterwards to do something called a process paper where they wrote to me about how they made part 1. So like for the students who used the AI tools and used that assistance, they talked to me about their brainstorming, about choosing their topic, whether it was easy or difficult. If they prompted AI, they included the exchange that they had with the tool. If students chose not to use generative AI tools, then they just talked to me about their process without them, right? Everybody in class did the experimentation. But you know, the ones who chose not to use the tools would basically say things like, it generated garbage, none of this was usable, right? And I encouraged them to kind of be open about how they felt about that brainstorming process. The thing that I felt was important about this, and it was kind of an experiment that whole year, but the different parts of the research project I graded like I would usually, right? But the process books were graded based on completion only. So I said, this is what I'm looking for. I want you to write me a 1-page minimum, right? I want you to think about answering these questions. And then I want you to turn it in on time. And if you do those things, then I'll give you an A on this assignment. The research paper was only worth slightly more in the whole course than the process papers were, because I wanted them to really value the opportunity to reflect and to describe their process and to critically think about how they were able to complete the research paper. So I did have to adjust the way that I weighted the assignments. Initially, the 4 parts, that whole paper as a whole, was worth like 40% of their overall grade in the course. After I kind of revised things and made changes, this parts 1 through 4, were more like 25% of their whole grade. And then the process papers were like 20%. So it was really significant, but I wanted them to see the value in just doing something, right? And thinking about something in kind of a more casual way, which they told me at the end also took a lot of the pressure off. They knew that they didn't have to say like really beautiful things, right? Like that, yes, they had to like, you know, they had to make sense, but you know, I really emphasized the value of that like reflective thinking in this. The other thing that I did in that class that they told me was really helpful and valuable was, you know, we were learning about AI tools all semester. So in addition to like me giving them stuff to do in class, right, and us kind of experimenting with the tools in class, we also did, I don't know if anybody here went through the AQ course, but one of the things that I learned when I did AQ was like the fishbowl kind of like assignment. Basically what you do is you give the whole class a reading assignment, and then a handful of students have to sit like in the middle of the room and talk about that reading assignment while everybody else listens. So what I did, I had been doing fishbowls for a few years after I learned what they were through AQ. So what I did was I gave them a couple of reading assignments that specifically talked about generative AI tools. And then we discussed them as a class, right? And that was really, really interesting because I made sure that I chose reading assignments that were really different. So like the first example is like a LinkedIn post that was talking about generative AI. And then the second example is from something else. And then I had like one that was from like a more scholarly journal, so that they can also kind of think about who wrote it, where it's published, what the purpose of it is, right? And all of those other sorts of big questions. But they told me that they really liked having reading that was about this topic so that they could learn some more of the complexities around it, right? So like the first example talks about bias in AI tools, which, you know, like we're talking more about now, but a year ago, we weren't really talking about that much, right? So it was important for those kinds of conversations.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I've encouraged my students to use, particularly when I teach a large introductory microeconomics course, is to use AI tools as a personalized tutor. I provide them, I provide them with you know, a personalized learning thing, which is sort of like adaptive learning, but they have to do a little bit more of the work themselves in structuring their learning paths, but it's giving them feedback on what concepts they mastered. I put together videos on topics that students always had trouble with embedded questions, but you know, students will get hung up on things where they're not understanding one small point that's preventing them from progressing forward. And it's when you're dealing with this, you know, with 2 or 3 or 400 students, it's kind of hard to address each individual student's questions, especially if they don't come in and talk to you, which in a large class, it's harder to get them to come in and talk to you. But one of the things I encourage them to do is to actually use AI to provide some personalized tutoring options where you can get unlimited retrieval practice with immediate feedback on whether they're right or wrong. And this is just a sample, which I encourage you to copy and paste this or something like it, but I would do it in Claude. It doesn't work so well in ChatGPT. It did pretty well like 3 or 4 months ago, but not so much anymore. But just you start by giving it the role to play, you know, one of the basic things of prompt engineering, and then you tell it what you want to understand better, and then just ask it to provide you with a sequence of review materials and to check your understanding by asking questions at each stage and providing feedback on the answers. So if you put something like this into Claude, it will give you a little bit of review material, ask you some questions, and you can define how many questions you wanted to ask. By default, Claude will give you short answer questions or short essay type questions. I think ChatGPT tends to start with multiple choice. It varies, but and you can structure that. You can tell it what type of questions, but then it tells you whether you're right or wrong and gives corrective materials. And you can do that as many times as you want. It doesn't get tired, and it's a really good way for students to get personalized assistance on things they don't understand. And this could work in pretty much any STEM class, but many others as well.
Okay. So, what we're going to do is, John and I have compiled 4 different, you know, like assignments or exercises that you could do with your students. These are assignments that you could do in class, or you could like give them as assignments to sort of take home. So I'm going to open this in just a second, but what we're going to do is we're going to go through one of them together in case, you know, you haven't had the opportunity to play with any of these tools or see them work in real time. And then if we have time after we do one together, John and I are going to encourage you to choose one of the other prompts and input that prompt either into ChatGPT or into Claude. So we have prompts that will fit in both. Did you have anything to say, John, before I open this? Okay.
Yeah, we can hop over to that.
Can I just open it like that? Oh, crud.
Oh.
Sorry. Beautiful. Okay. All right, so these are our prompts. John, do you want to?
Well, would you rather have an economics one or a writing one? Any voices in the chat?
Anybody have a preference?
Writing, no offense, John.
Okay. I don't see who's there, so okay.
Thanks, Amy. All right, so here are 2 of the writing prompts. I've done both of these before with my students. Example 3 we actually did in class, and it was a really fascinating conversation. And then example 4 is something else that we did in class, but it was more kind of like a personalized thing. So let's look at example 3, I guess, because I think it's interesting. So what we do is we would ask ChatGPT to act as a high school student applying to a SUNY school of your choice. Have ChatGPT write a college admissions essay that outlines your qualifications and interests. So we're going to keep this, like for this purpose, we're going to keep it relatively vague. Because it's fascinating how the tools will kind of fill in the relevant information. You can always go back and modify it if you want to. After we do that, we're going to ask ChatGPT to act as a high school student applying to Harvard or another Ivy League school of your choice, and then have the generative AI tool write a college admissions essay that outlines your qualifications and interests. So then we analyzed the result of the two essays and kind of compared how the generative AI tool made the SUNY admissions essay sound and how it made the admissions essay to Harvard or another Ivy League sound. So what we'll do is go through it on our screen, but you can feel free also, you know, you have your computers, if you would like to take the same prompt and input it, right, then please feel free to.
Or a different one.
Or one of the others,
Losing a
yep,
little focus. but-
one of the others, yeah. Okay, so John, how do I, because you've got it open here, do I just like drag this tab
Yeah,
over?
just drag it over.
Okay, cool. Let's actually drag it over, hang on, the thing, yeah, it's, there it goes. Okay. Okay,
Yeah, just change the tab.
Yeah. okay.
Now, we should know, this is the paid version. This is the one that just came out this past week, so it's gonna do a whole lot better.
Okay, should I open the free
Well,
one?
it might not be bad for people to see the difference.
Okay,
Because then you can try your own with the free version, and this will be better.
we're gonna add this. So what I added was this essay should be no longer than 750 words. That's one of the sets of instructions that you can give to make it a little bit more
To
specific.
avoid an infinite loop, get rid of ChatGPT. Otherwise, it
God,
will be asking
yep.
ChatGPT to write.
That would be
it.
pretty funny, wouldn't it? Right, a college admissions essay. All right, here we go. So, and as John said, this is the paid one, so this one will, you know, do some things.
This is a lot better than the free one.
Okay, so we're gonna skim for highlights. And people online, if you want, feel free to like jump it. I'll kind of like scroll through slow. But just like you can either type in the chat or just shout out anything that just stands out to you, anything that you notice that seems noteworthy or mentionable.
I have one.
Go for it.
Okay, so I've seen a version of this workshop before, and I think it used the same intro as I stand on the brink of my future.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay. What do you think about that introduction?
I think that people are gonna notice if that
That
keeps
there's a lot of
coming up.
similar.
Yeah.
That these students are potentially using ChatGPT to write these essays.
Okay. So I'll note briefly, oh, hang on, let me see the chat. Amy says, scenic Hudson Valley, who would say that? So I'll note that this student is applying to SUNY Binghamton, and they do have a 4.0 GPA, and they want to study environmental science. President of Environmental Club. Science Olympiad. And commitment to sustainability. Okay. So what we're gonna do is go back to the right tab. Control mouse. Yep. Yep. and less than 750 words. Okay, so let's see what it does for an Ivy League school. Begin to crystallize.
Yeah.
Bit more of emphasis on public service and
Mhm.
those types of organizations.
Yeah.
Internships.
This student has organized and participated in conferences, which the SUNY student did not do.
Yeah.
Did the SUNY student volunteer?
So there was
Mm.
environmental issues, but I don't know
Yeah.
if there's as much volunteer.
Yeah.
Whatever the Olympiad was, I don't know.
Yeah,
if that
science
was-
Olympiad, that's
Yeah.
school, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
school thing, yeah.
Yeah.
So this
But that-
student has interned with a nonprofit
Mhm.
organization.
Higher income people tend to have more time, they're not working, they're not.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And they
Yeah.
tend to have more opportunities for that in the schools.
Yep. This one also I noticed gave examples of like specific, like the works of
Philosophers.
political philosophers, yeah, which named that, which the environmental one didn't mention like anything specific in that regard.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I did with my English 102 students is, and actually when I did this assignment in class, the SUNY students essay was, like these actually have some similarities, right? Like both students have a 4.0 GPA. You know, like they were both sort of robust in their different ways, although the
Mhm.
Ivy League applicant certainly had more,
Mhm.
right, than the SUNY applicant. But one of the things that we spent time talking about, which was really fascinating, was, you know, what are some of the assumptions, right, that the AI tool is sort of making, right, about like somebody who would be applying to a SUNY school versus somebody who would be applying to an Ivy League. Are there differences in things like tone or diction or syntax or content, right? We were talking about the content a little bit in the room. So thinking about like from my students' perspective, does this sound like you? Does this sound like a student? Does it sound like someone who's believable? Just with a very, very broad, very open-ended prompt, right? You could obviously add a lot more to this prompt to make it specific, but like, does this sound like it's an accurate representation of somebody who would be coming to a SUNY school? Does the Ivy League school offer more, right? And why is that? Why is that? So this is an exercise that we did in class that they found to be really interesting. And there are similar things that I've done as well, which like another example is, you know, have the generative AI tool make an essay, right? And then evaluate the quality of the essay, right? Just on a very basic level, you know, what's working well, what's not working so well. One thing that's really interesting is that I found that many of my students don't know how to prompt engineer very well so far, right? So generally what they will do is they'll just take whatever you've got on the assignment sheet and they'll whip that into it, right? And a lot of the times if you have extra context that you've talked about in your class that the AI tool doesn't know about, then that becomes problematic, right? Like the tool isn't as good as fulfilling the assignment. So, but a lot of the times that's what students will do. But it's interesting to have it generate an essay and then have your students evaluate it and see, you know, okay, what's working well, what's maybe not working well, what's perhaps biased or problematic about the content that was generated.
And for those who want to learn more about prompt engineering, there will be a workshop on that coming up in 2 weeks.
That's right.
Actually, go back to example 2. We're not going to do
Certainly.
it, but
Yep.
this is something, I did say economics, but this is something you could use in any discipline. Ask people, this is one of my favorite type of activities, to ask students to interview some historical person. And you could give different people, assign them different people, or give them a list in a form and let them cross it out, or I'm sorry, in a Google Doc, and they could cross it out when it's selected so that everyone's doing someone different. But have people go back, pick some people in your discipline who did some important work, and ask students to interview them. And they could interview them about current topics or other topics that they may not have written about, but you could get the perspective of a particular philosopher or a particular school of thought and so forth, where, you know, where students are being evaluated based on the depth of their questions or how good their questioning is, whether they are demonstrating a knowledge of the subject by asking good questions and following them up appropriately. And you can give them feedback on that and encourage them to develop those types of skills, because they're going to be querying AI tools in the future. And this is a good way of getting some practice at that. And Claude in particular, or the new ChatGPT, does really well with these types of questions. And that ChatGPT 4 is only available for paid people right now, but within the next month or so, it should roll out to pretty much everyone in the free version. The only difference is the paid version will analyze images more and will talk to you and will do what does voice recognition. The free one doesn't do as much with other types of media. It will still recognize images, but it doesn't generate, well, it does generate images, but it doesn't interact by voice quite as much. And it won't, I don't think it will analyze videos. This version will analyze videos.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning too that like the example of like the high school students writing their applications, you know, like we use the free version to look at that in class, which I forgot for a minute that we were using the paid version just now, which explains why the quality of the output was so much better. But I'd encourage you, you know, like you don't need an account to use ChatGPT anymore. You can just go to the website, right, and to start throwing stuff in. So I'd encourage you to experiment with it, and then you can kind of see, okay, like how are the qualities different of this output versus the paid one if you don't have that one.
One thing we should mention as a caution though is that if you use it with student work, don't put any identifying information because it could become part of the training database, and you know we should be concerned about protecting student privacy. Back to the slide.
Yes.
And I think at this point, we're going to ask people to try some prompt or at least consider a prompt and go to that whiteboard tool. Maybe. Oh, no, yeah, that's the last slide. So,
Okay.
but we're there. And if you hit it one more time, maybe it'll pop up with the URL. There we go. So here, does anyone have any examples of a prompt they'd like to try or that you may have just tried? And this should take you to a whiteboard with sticky notes on it. It was the closest thing I could find to Jamboard, which is going away. Does anyone have any questions or suggestions while we're on this?
I actually have a question, but it is not related to AI. And maybe I can ask later. It's just that how do you create these QR codes? But because whatever websites I'm finding to create QR codes, they're all paid.
There's several ways. The easiest way is with Google. If you just have the address in your browser window and you're on that page, you click on the 3 dots on the right side of Chrome, go down to sharing, and one of the options is to create a QR code, and it will pop it right up on the screen, and you can either copy it or you can download it and then embed it. I could do that with this one, because, this one, this one goes to a website and it goes to a registration site and it automatically transfers, so I couldn't have it there long enough to be able to grab that URL. So I went to, it was, io dot something, which does generate a free one. You can always just do a Google search for free QR code generators and you'll find hundreds of them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone have any examples or want to try another prompt? We are getting near the end, so I guess,
Close to the end.
okay. Oh, you want to just go there to see if anyone, oh, I can put a link to that.
Oh,
Is anyone, are you on?
I'm not on it.
Okay.
what's that?
Okay, well, yeah, we can go on ahead and it will look back and you'll have access to this later if you have it open.
Somebody has something in the chat.
Okay.
From Peter, a prompt, create a table that outlines different levels of AI assistance on an assignment.
Yes.
Fascinating. Were you happy with the results of that, Peter? Do you mind?
Yeah, it's usable. Like it's something I could put in I would have to make some adjustments to it, as most things that you generate using AI, but I could put it in a syllabus and say you can use up to level 3 or you can use up to level 4. And it is actually very helpful. I think it takes away some of the ambiguity there for students about what level of AI use is okay and then what is too much and not acceptable. So yeah, I'm happy with it.
That's great.
And a great use of AI, which we'll be talking about in a later workshop, is to use AI to help prepare course materials, including that type of thing. Or to evaluate your reading list or your syllabus to see if it reflects diversity goals and objectives and so forth. You could make sure that your reading lists are diverse and so on with one of the more sophisticated AI tools. And just in general, there's a website which is called, there's an AI for that, which has lists of tens of thousands of AI tools, which is growing pretty much by the day.
Amy says that she's trying to look one up from her daughter's English homework for 10th grade. So she says, give me a second. I really like the, if you go back to our list and have some time to mess around with it. John and I both had examples for our different disciplines, but I really like it when you prompt an AI tool to help you do something like one step at a time. So you can have it either like if you are studying, then you can have it ask you one question at a time. If you're brainstorming, you can have it kind of like offer one piece to think about at a time. And you can kind of engage in like this weird dialogue, right? But you know, it works really nicely because you can use it as a way to help yourself think through things, which I really liked and my students liked a lot too. John and I each had examples about that in the document that we had up in the assignment examples.
And you can debate with an AI, tell it to play a role and debate with that one-on-one, have it go back and forth point by point. And again, Claude does that really well. The paid version of ChatGPT does pretty well. The free one, not so much.
Claude has an interesting thing also that has on their page, they've got like a list of like ways to engineer prompts, which I thought was really fascinating, which ChatGPT I don't think has done anything with yet. Did you find anything, Amy? No.
Okay. Well,
No, I'm trying to do this without like showing up on her Google Classroom and getting her in trouble because I know she's in English right now. But we were using it yesterday. They read The Serpent King, and there was like some really interesting questions. And I put it in ChatGPT with her and explained or showed her how inefficient it was for that, because it was definitely more of like a critical thinking thing, which was awesome. But then that evening, last night we were she was working on chemistry. She thought I was helping her, but I wasn't. And we she had a chemistry question, she put it in there and it gave her step-by-step how to do it, which was awesome because I didn't know how to do it. And she actually had the answer right, but she wanted to make sure because she wanted to learn it. So I thought it was interesting to see the two different sides. I just can't get this prompt in fast
And
enough,
if you
so.
do some type of work, you can always submit it to one of the tools and ask them to check your work or to evaluate your arguments for weaknesses or strengths and so forth.
Yeah, I think we'll have more
Interesting.
on this. One of our other presentations, I can't remember which one because there's a few,
We've got a
but
few, I
um,
think, yeah, 6 or 7.
yeah, so one of the other ones we'll talk more about like AI tools and like how students can use them to help them learn and whatever. But I think
One more slide.
oh no, this is it, I think.
No, one more. Oh, then it was right before that.
There's this one, the share your
Oh,
thoughts
no,
one.
there should be one more.
I think it's.
That
There
one.
we go. Yeah.
Okay, yep.
That, one of the points that I wanted to make is that, AI tools are being used really actively. A lot of people have already lost their jobs because they've been replaced by AI bots and so forth. That's not something entirely new. That's been going on for about a decade, but the rate has certainly accelerated. There was an interesting study done by some grad students working with, actually a Nobel Prize winner at MIT, I believe, where they did an experiment in the company where they were looking at the impact of AI on worker productivity. I forgot what the company was, I gotta check that again. But basically what they found is that it narrowed the gap between less experienced and more experienced workers. It had very little impact on workers who had been there, from what I recall, 5 years or more. But for workers who were relatively new in the company, it raised their productivity almost to the level of the workers who had been there longer. Companies recognizing that are going to be using AI more and more. And the surveys I've seen are really all over the place right now, but from what I've seen, anywhere between 40% and 70% of employers are using AI tools in one or more roles in the company, and somewhere around half of employees are using them at least some of the time as part of their jobs. We have to prepare students for the world in which they're going to be living, and the world in which they're living now is one where AI is rapidly becoming a standard part of day-to-day life. And it's in a lot of the things that we use, even if we don't recognize that. So, we should be preparing them not for our past, but maybe for their futures.
So we're at
Where have we
153.
run a little?
Yep. Does anybody have any final questions or comments for us before we
You could end the slides.
Okay.
Get the people back.
get the people back?
Get the people back.
The people. There they are.
Any questions, thoughts, reactions?
I actually have a question. And my question is related to giving credit to AI. I know, and I'm talking in terms of strictly about as an editing tool, when you're checking the grammar, when you're checking proofreading, the punctuation and all those things. Should we be giving any kind of credit to AI for doing that? Because before AI, we used to use our friends to review our papers. We never gave them any credit. Yes, we would say them thank you, but not in a written form. What are your thoughts on that?
I think anything generated by AI should be cited somehow in the work. There's an interesting type of watermarking that Google is working on with its tool, where it's actually embedding watermarks on AI material, and that's persistent, so that if materials are generated by AI, it's visible with their viewer to show what parts were AI generated. Not, I'm sure other people will come out with tools to remove the watermarks at some point, but it's a constant battle there. But in general, I think if you are using a tool in some role, it's probably appropriate to cite it or make reference to that. And I know there are all of the major groups that have citation formats are coming up with some way of citing AI's contributions.
But I wonder, like what you were talking about also was strictly as an edit, like strictly as a proofreading tool, like
Correct.
not to necessarily add content, but to look and do things like check grammar and like that kind of stuff.
Correct. And I also do not require I also make sure that my students are not, so if they have put in something in ChatGPT, they proofread it using ChatGPT, make the formal tone or active, passive, and all those issues that they have in their writing. When they're writing, and when they change things, I do not let them copy paste as it is. I just say, okay, compare the two documents, change a word if AI has given you a better word, see if there is a comma needed, see if there is a period needed. So they're not copy pasting or inserting blindly. They are changing small stuff grammatically in their manuscripts.
Would you cite a dictionary if you look something up?
Yeah.
Exactly. That is exactly my
cite
question.
a
Would you cite a
thesaurus or
calculator?
a spell checker?
Yeah.
It's almost like,
It's a
like,
gray area.
yeah, or like using, like going to tutoring, right? Like going to the writing
Exactly.
center, having somebody look over. And I mean, in my experience, no one has been citing like Grammarly, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that was the AI tool that existed before ChatGPT did. So I mean, I think if it's strictly a proofreading tool, then I think it's a little bit different, right? If it's like adding content, then that's one thing. But I mean, for proofreading, it's kind of a tough area.
Yeah, I suspect most people would probably not cite it if it's just proofreading
It's
or
just
general
proofreading,
suggestions.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's when a substantial portion, when much of the content
stuff
is
is in there,
generated by
yeah.
AI, then it should be, but
That's a
Yeah.
good question.
yeah.
And then I wonder, whether are we reprimanding students because of that, or some other person because of that, because it shows that maybe student may have not used that word, but I feels like I hope we are not penalizing students for using AI strictly as a grammatical
One of
tool.
my advisees came in with a concern because a professor had accused him of using AI because some of the words he used were not ones he thought the student would generally know.
Yeah.
And he was not a native English speaker, and the words you happen to hit as you're learning a language, might sometimes include ones that are not commonly used because they're not used to everyday conversations in English and don't know the most common usages. So it is something we have to be careful with.
That's true.
And in general, even if you are able to get 98% accuracy in detecting AI generated content, that's still 2% of students who could be falsely accused. And that rate only occurs if there's at least 300 words that are being used. One case I was shown by the student, the student had written maybe about 200 words or 150 words, and much of it was just graphs that he had generated, and he showed me that where he had downloaded, he showed me how he had created it, and it was a bit troubling. I think when we see good work from students, it's sometimes easy to say, well, this must be done by ChatGPT because it reads pretty well, and I'd be careful with doing that. We don't want to discourage students from turning in good work.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. That was a good question though.
My students were actually, Stephanie, they were very hesitant to use AI. Like I had to push them to use AI.
Yeah.
So I had been collecting data, and I know I mentioned to John in another place, I had been collecting data on why they're finding AI useful or not useful. So I do have data on 80 students of mine, and we'll see what I can do with it. But they are hesitant. They are not like us. I think I am more open than them to use AI.
Surveys of students, ACT did a big one last fall, find that somewhere around 50% of students use AI tools fairly regularly, but 28% of that group think that it's academically dishonest to do that. And I think having ethical discussions of what is appropriate and what isn't, and as Peter suggested, it depends on what they're doing. There may be some cases like coming up with concept ideas or outlining or evaluating work where it's a perfectly legitimate use. But if the entire assignment is being done by them, then by AI, that's probably not so useful. But those discussions are really important, I think.
That's when I was doing the fish bowls, and we did a couple like on ethics especially, and my students were like fascinated by the topic, and they had lots of things to say about it and lots of opinions, and I felt like that was a really valuable learning experience for everybody, right, to hear all those opinions. So I agree that it's like refreshing that they are, I don't know, really critically thinking about what this means and how it will affect them. But I don't want to mess up John's schedule.
Well, yeah, we are pretty much at the end. But,
Okay.
but again, we don't have any else scheduled in this room right now. So
Okay.
if there's any other questions?
Yeah.
Or thoughts?
I have a quick question actually in pertaining to Grammarly, because I do use that a lot, and I think my students do. So is it still the gray area if they,
So
let's
I
say,
encourage my
right?
students to use it. I beg them to use it.
I mean, I use it and I tried to hook it up to my daughter's computer, but I don't know, they must have some sort of block on it from work, from school, from her
Yeah.
school. Yeah, so she'll do it on my computer, but it's, if there's like a whole paragraph, so let's say I have a whole paragraph because I'm writing a book myself and I did this, and it's all my own work, and then I go to Grammarly AI and say, make it more engaging. Is that, where does that fall in terms of like academic integrity and all that? Granted, it's me doing it, but still.
I guess the question would be like, how much does it change?
And even
You
then,
know?
suppose you were writing a book and it went to an editor and
Right.
the editor made
Yes.
exactly the same suggestions.
Right,
Would the editor be
Right,
accepted as a co-author? If they're
Right.
your ideas, your thoughts, your
right.
basic organization, you know, and you're deciding whether to accept the change or not in
Right.
terms of whether it represents an improvement to the exposition of your ideas, but I don't think that would generally be considered, you know, something citable.
Okay. Because I am writing a book and I've been doing, I do it a little bit, but honestly, what I do, and I wouldn't just cut and paste it, but it might say, like I said, describe a particular area in Hawaii, let's say. And it just gave me like a couple words that sparked my memory. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And so I kind of use it in that way. And I found it very helpful.
I mean, that doesn't sound too different from, like, I've copy edited like many different kinds of writing, right? And that's the same kind of thing, right? Like somebody gives me something and says, hey, can you clean this up? Or can you make it, can you add more adjectives or like whatever?
Yes.
It doesn't,
Yes.
it's the same kind of idea,
All right, that's good to know. Because I mean, I'm trained as writing scientifically, not creatively. So it's been quite a transition and I have found it helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I was distracted by the chat for a minute. Yeah.
So, yeah, if you could stop the recording and then we can end this session. Yeah, go to the three
The three dots,
yeah,
right? And then
and then stop
Stop
recording.
recording.
Stop, yeah, and then,
yes.
yes.